Well, grab a Bible if you got one handy and start making your way to Exodus chapter 24. Exodus chapter 24 this morning, page 55 in the Bibles that look like mine. That's what I was going to tell you. If you need to borrow a Bible or keep a Bible, we've got some spread out all around you. Look just like this. Go to Exodus chapter 24, page 55 in these, and I'll meet you there in just a second. If you're just joining us this week for this series, whether you're here in person or you're joining us online, welcome. It's good to have you guys. I think I can catch you up on what we started last week. So that you feel like you're still a part of it. That's important to us. So we started a series last week we called the 40-Day Lab. And the whole idea of this series is, I believe most of us, and I include myself in this, experience and encounter God the same way we encounter and experience organic chemistry. So if you ever took an organic chemistry class, you know most of your experience with it and encounter with it is limited to listening to an expert lecture. And you kind of take good notes as you go along to the lecture, try to make sure that you record all the things that are most important for you to know. Some of you, you're overachievers. Not only do you just take good notes during the lecture, but you spend a little time with the textbook outside of class. Some of you maybe one day a week, some of you several days a week, you'd get back into the textbook because you wanted to check and make sure that the lecturer didn't leave something out, or he didn't get something wrong. So you go through and you check it out for yourself, which is good. And then some of us, power users, we gather together with a small group of people. We study it together. And again, so that we, in case the lecturer left something out and we missed something when we looked at the textbook, we all look together, compare notes, so that we're all prepared for the final exam at the end, whatever it's about, however difficult it is. What we said last week is a lot of us encounter and experience God in exactly the same way as we do organic chemistry. And all along the way, we believe that it's true. We believe that it's important. We might even believe that it's useful, or at least it's going to be useful to us at some point in some way someday. But for the life of us, we can't figure out how is this going to apply to our real life every day. So we just keep taking notes, showing up, studying with the textbook, and hoping at some point when it shows up, we're ready to do it. But we're never ready to do that with organic chemistry. We need something else. We need a little intermediate step. We need a bridge between the lecture and our life. And what we said last week is that's what the lab is for. The lab is the bridge between the lecture and life. And here's the really cool thing about the story of God and the people of God. All throughout the story of God, God would invite his people into these moments where he would make them a promise. And really, a lot of times at the huge strategic, pivotal moments for his people, he would make a promise to them, and then he would take somebody out of the moment and into a lab. And for 40 days and 40 nights, he would let them experience and kind of live into the promise so that they could express the promise to the people around them, who could experience it and express it to the people around them, and experience it and express it to the people around them. But in between, there was this 40-day, 40-night lab, the bridge between the lecture and life. And so, starting last week, for 40 days and 40 nights, we're going to the lab with them. And in fact, inviting you not just to listen to the lecture on Sunday morning, we're looking at some of those stories throughout the history of the people of God and talking about what they experienced in the 40-day lab together. But I'm inviting you every day, now for the next 33 days, to experiment in the lab, in a controlled environment, get your hands a little dirty so that you're prepared for what you experience in everyday life when you get ready to experience it in everyday life. And so if you want to join the lab with us, there's still time to do that. 33 days left, and there are instructions for how to do that in the sermon notes part of your worship guide. So easiest way to do it, turn your cell phone off or the silent, put it on silent or do not disturb, and then text the word 40-day lab, so the numbers 40-day lab, type it all as one word and text it to the number 33222. You're going to get a response text saying, hey, you're in. And I think we fixed all of the bugs. A couple of you had some bugs that you got the response, but you didn't get the experiments this week. Hopefully you're getting those now, and we've got all of that fixed. But if you want to opt in for 33 days now, we started last week, for 33 days and only 33 days, you'll get one text and only one text every day with an experiment for you to try, again, in a controlled environment, just like a lab, so that you can experience and express and try to live with what it would look like for you to live through the promises of God in everyday life, which is what we're all after. So hopefully you'll join all of that out today. And we're going to continue in it this morning in Exodus chapter 24. We get going in that. Let me just tell you, as a teacher and sometimes as a professor, one of my very least favorite questions to hear from students, and yet when I was a student, my very favorite question to ask from a professor goes something like this. Yeah, am I going to need to know this for the exam? You ever ask that question? Any professors, teachers, don't you hate that question? Like as a teacher, I hate that question because it reflects a posture from the students that sort of says, hey, prof, like this is super boring. And I really don't get it. Like I don't have any idea what you're doing, but we can make this arrangement together if it's okay with you. So you just do your thing, and I'll go do my thing, and you keep talking about your thing, and I'll pretend to be listening to your thing as long as I'm not going to be accountable to your thing at the end of this thing. Is this going to be on the exam? As a student, I love to ask the question of the professor because it gives me an opportunity to know for pretty darn sure how to master what matters the most to the professor. And I want to master what matters the most for the professor when it comes to the 40-day lab. Mastering what matters to the master, it sort of feels like a pretty big deal, doesn't it? So here's the big question that I want us to wrestle with this morning. Are the most important things to your Christianity, whatever your Christianity looks like, are the most important things to your Christianity the most important things to your Christ? Are the most important things to your Christianity, whatever your Christianity looks like, the most important things to your Christianity, the most important things to your Christ? So think about this. If somebody was to shadow you and us around every day, all day, for the rest of this week, for the rest of this month, for the rest of the year, maybe for the rest of your life, and we didn't change anything about our life. So everywhere we went, they went. Everything we said, they heard. Everything we did, they watched. They went where we went. They watched what we spent. After watching what we did and hearing what we said and going where we went and watching what we spent, if they wrote a research paper around what was most important to Christ followers, would the things on their list at the end of the experience be the same as on God's list when it comes to the life that He wants? That's what we want to talk about this morning. Let me set the stage for you really quickly where we're going in Exodus chapter 24. A few chapters after Noah. We looked at Noah last week, Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9. And God finds a guy named Abram, just a couple of chapters after Noah, and invites him to follow God. And God promises Abram, I'm going to give you a son. That was a big deal to Abram and his wife. They hadn't been able to have children. God says, I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to give you a land, and I'm going to bless your socks off. And actually, Abram, I'm going to bless you and your family so much that it wells up inside of you and spills out over you into your family, and from your family well up in you and spill out over you to their family and their family and their family, and ultimately I'm going to bless you so much that all of the nations of the earth are going to be blessed because of how I bless you. And sure enough, God gives Abram and Sarai, his wife, a son. And then he has a son, and he has a son, and they keep having sons. And God keeps promising a land, and God keeps blessing them. Over and over and over they bless, right up to the point that there's a whole bunch of them, and they find themselves in Egypt. And there's so many of them in Egypt that the Egyptians say there's too many of them for us to keep control over, so let's subject them to slavery. And at the end of the book of Genesis, it sure looks like God's promise to these people is coming to a screeching halt. And about 3 months before the situation that we're going to talk about today, God miraculously sets these people, which is now a huge extended family, free. And they leave Egypt and they go across the Red Sea on dry ground, and God leads them toward the land that He says, I've still promised. They find themselves walking there in the wilderness between their past and God's promise, and they all have a question. Now what do we do? And at this moment, when we pick up their story, all of the people of God have a relatively similar story. They follow God primarily because of their heritage and their history. The people of God follow God primarily because of the family they grew up in, the people they grew up around, because of the history story they have in which just 3 months earlier, God rescued them and set them free and turned them loose towards their promise, which he hadn't given them yet. So just think for a second about what they have in common with us. Many of us, isn't that true of us? Not all of us, but a whole bunch of us, we would say one of the primary reasons that we follow God is because of our heritage. Like we grew up in a family, they followed Jesus, and so we follow Jesus. Like we're Americans, so I guess we're Christian, because that kind of feels like it goes together. It's part of our heritage. That's why we do what we do and we are who we are. It's our heritage. And a whole bunch of us would say, and I've got a history with this God. Like this God, because in the person of Jesus, when I put my trust in him, he rescued me, he set me free, and he's given me life. And I'm living here between my past and God's promise. Someday he'll take me to be with him, but today, here I am, stuck in the land between the past and the promise, asking the question, now what do I do? Now, we're not the people of Israel. We had a lot in common with the people of Israel at this point in the story of God. Look at Exodus chapter 24, beginning in verse 12. God takes a man named Moses, the same man that led them out of Egypt and towards the promised land, and he takes him into a 40-day lab. And I want you to see what he invites him into as he invites him into the lab. Verse 12, Exodus chapter 24, beginning in verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, these words are important, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here. And I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandments I've written for their instruction." And Moses set out with Joshua's aid. And Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. And check out this detail. For 6 days, the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day, the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. And Moses entered the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. All right, you understand what's happening? Let me draw out a couple of details for you here. God invites Moses up onto the mountain where he's going to set in stone, literally, the law and the commandments for his people. The law and the commandments that he's already promised to these people back in Exodus chapter 20, beginning with the 10 commandments, the top 10 list that you all are familiar with. And he invites Moses up onto the mountain to experience something for 40 days and 40 nights that we're going to see God expects Moses is going to experience, then go back down the mountain and express for all of the people so that they can experience it and express it to all of the other people and to all of the other people and all the other people. And to someday somebody's going to experience it, express it so that you have an opportunity to experience it and express it as well. God invites Moses up onto the mountain, and he says right at the very beginning, verse 12, the Lord says to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here." Now, when you read that, you just kind of read right by it. For the people who would have read this, and certainly for the people that experienced this in the first time, this is a really, really, really big deal. See, prior to this, the people in the story of God didn't expect to be able to stay in the presence of God, and most of them, save one or two, maybe representatives, would never even be able to be in the presence of God. They didn't expect that. They could hear the promise of God. They could live in the story of God. But to live, to remain, to stay in the presence of God, they just assumed that would destroy them. So nobody did it. Nobody even expected it. Nobody knew to ask for it or experience it. Moses himself, up to this point, he'd go up on the mountain, come back down the mountain, go up down the mountain, go up the mountain, come back down the mountain. And in fact, in the passage right before this one, Moses and all of the leaders have this incredible meal with God where he confirms this covenant he's going to make with all of the people. And the thing they take away from the meal is, holy cow, we're in the presence of God, and he didn't kill us. And so when Moses gets this invitation, it's a staggering invitation to go into the presence of God and stay there. Idea that a person could stand in the presence of God, much less stay in the presence of God, something nobody really expected to experience in their real life. And for 40 days and 40 nights, Moses lives his life the presence of God, but with his feet still on the earth. Do you see that? He's up on a mountain, feet still on the earth, experiencing the presence of God. He lives in the real world, but he's sort of removed from the real world. He's in a controlled environment. Yet when you get to the end of the 40 days, you realize that God's desire is that what Moses experienced, he would take back down the mountain and invite everybody to experience. They lived in those days like a whole bunch of us tend to live in these days. Like God is just a faraway God, somewhere distant, that we'll see him and experience him and be with him someday when we're not in the real world anymore. For today, we just study the textbook that he left us so we can know the rules and what he expects, what he wants, to prepare for the exam before we go into his presence from a distance. Like primarily what he wants from us is for us to collect a whole bunch of facts and keep a whole bunch of rules. But God makes it really clear to Moses before he says anything about the rules that the 40-day, 40-night lab is an opportunity for Moses to remain in God's presence. To remain in God's presence. And this is what I love about Moses' experience in the presence of God, because it's a whole lot like my experience in the presence of God. Like if you believe you live in the presence of God, more than just theory, Moses goes into the presence of God. Like what does that even look like? And I think we have these expectations of what it would look like and what we'd experience, which is not what it looks like or what Moses experiences. You notice that? Verse 16, he gets ready to go into the presence of God, and for 6 days, he's there in the presence of God, and what does God say? Nothing. It's silent. Even though God shows up, God doesn't speak up. And even though God shows up, he probably doesn't show up in everything and in every way that Moses expected and that we expect that God's going to show up. You notice Moses climbs up on the mountain. He's got the position for perspective on everybody that he leads and everything that he does. And he's expecting, I'm with God, they're going to follow. And they're expecting, he's with God, but we don't know what that looks like. There's a cloud that covers the mountain. He can't see them, and they can't see him, and that turns out to be important. And I think it's important for us. Because the temptation for some of us is to spend time in the presence of God or to go into an encounter with God, maybe even in this 40-day lab experience that we're trying, and say, okay, day one, all right, God, I'm ready to encounter you. What you got? And it's quiet. He's silent. We hear nothing, no voice, no nudge, no nothing. We know in theory God's there. We know technically, yeah, God probably showed up, but he didn't speak up. So we're tempted to give up. We pull up on the yoke in our experience. We go into this controlled environment. We just decide, okay, we're going to try this thing out. We go to God and we climb up the mountain where we're in the position for perspective. And we just assume God's going to give us clarity from there on all of the people that we lead, the people we're responsible for, the things that he's called us to be, and the things that he's called us to do. And it doesn't suddenly become clear. We're walking in a fog, living in a cloud. We're like, well, I guess that didn't work. It's important to see we've got to learn how to live in the presence of God even when we can't hear the voice of God audibly or see all of God's perspective physically. Moses walks into the cloud. He stays there for 40 days and 40 nights. He remains in the presence of God. He doesn't always hear something. He can't always see everything. But he's there. Pay attention to this. When God speaks up during the 40 days and 40 nights, it's important to notice what God does say when God gets ready to speak. God gives them some rules, and you see those. In fact, chapter 35 all the way through 31 tells us what God told Moses up there in the 40-day lab. You see some rules, but it's not probably the rules that you would expect God to give during an encounter with God during those moments. Like, okay, Moses, here's how you need to get your act together, and all the other people need to get their act together. So, number one, be nice to people. Like, number two, do the right thing all the time. Like, number three, make sure you show up in church on Sunday morning and you do the right things in the right order and the right way, and you memorize the right facts and prepare for the final exam. This is what I need you to know when it comes time for your final at the end. Except that's not what God tells Moses. And in fact, during this 40 days and 40 nights, it's not even the top 10 that God leads with. He leads with something that at first sounds really, really strange. Actually, in chapter 25, he starts with an offering. So we're not going to talk about that because that makes church people uncomfortable. He talks with an offering, but the offering has a purpose. And you see what the purpose is, chapter 25. Just look at the heading. The purpose of the offering is to build a tabernacle. But look why God wants them to build that tabernacle in the middle of their camp. Verse 8 of chapter 25, it says, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me," and here are the important words, "I will dwell among them." Like this thing that you're experiencing, Moses, I want everybody to experience. I want to dwell among them. There's going to be a place that I want to dwell. And he gives them instructions for an ark, which is the symbolic place of the presence of God right in the middle of the tabernacle. And he tells them in chapter 25, verse 22, they're above the cover of that box, between the two cherubim that are over the ark of the covenant law, I will meet with you. Then he gives instructions. There's a table and a lampstand and a tent that houses it all called a tabernacle. It's got an altar in it. It would sit in the middle of the place that they camped, wherever they put their camp. Right there in the center is this tent called the tabernacle. And he gives them garments for all of the priests to wear every time that they're there so that people would always see them as the priests went about their worship, not just on one day, but every single day in this tabernacle, and how they should be set apart as priests. And he tells them why. Chapter 29, verse 46, it says, "Then they will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." Not just I was the God of their history and heritage way back when. Not just I will be the God of the promise in some place, someday, in some way. He says, I am their God, and here's the goal. I want to dwell with them. So there in the 40-day lab, what's God doing for Moses? He's inviting him to experience something in a controlled environment. God wants him to express to all of the people, not just to remain in his presence. That's God's desire. He's helping them remember the priority that God has for all of his people. What's the priority? What matters most? Well, there on the mountain, God reminds Moses over and over and over is that his desire is for everyone to experience what Moses is experiencing, for them to live every day actively in the presence of God. God's priority is not just for his people to keep rules. It's not just for his people every once in a while to go through a ritual, show up to a place, then get back to real life after they're done. It's for his people to keep responding to the fact that he's a God who lives with them, who dwells with them in person, personally, every single day. You notice all of those rules that God gives to Moses over the 40-day lab are simply a way for God to systematize the presence of God, the experience of the presence of God, in a way that it stays in front of the people everywhere they are and wherever they go, every time that they're there. You see that? The tabernacle, it was a tent, and it was designed to be temporary, so that every time these wandering people got up and moved someplace else, they'd put it right back smack in the middle of the camp. But not only so that it could go with them wherever they go, a reminder that God goes with them wherever they go, it's also a reminder that's placed right in the center of the camp, so that during the day, they can't go anywhere without recognizing, without seeing right there in front of them, our God goes with us. Our God lives with us. Our God's present with us wherever we go. Because when you live your whole life, the presence of God, your whole life becomes a response to the presence of God. Not just something you do one day a week. We have a word for that. And actually, it's the word worship. Worship's not just the first half of the service on Sunday morning. Not just the genre of music that you may choose to listen to on the radio if you don't listen to country or rap or rock or what oldies, whatever you listen to, talk radio. Oh, I could listen to worship. Worship's what happens when we remember and respond and reorient our lives around whatever is ultimate to us. And everybody worships. God says to Moses during the 40-day lab, I want my people to remember I'm present. and to respond to the fact that I'm present. I want them to orient their whole lives so that wherever they go, whatever they're doing, they see right in the middle of the camp, oh yeah, wherever I'm going, he's going too. Whatever I'm doing, he's there with me. Whatever I'm saying in the presence of God. Wants them to remember and to respond in everything and to reorient their lives on the presence of the purpose of God, person of God, because everybody's going to worship something ultimate. Everybody responds to whatever you believe is ultimate in your life and reorients your life around whatever's ultimate to you. God says to Moses during the 40-day lab, here's what I want for you, and I want it to spill out over you and through you to all of the people around you, the people that you return to, your friends, your family, your neighbors, all of the people that you lead. I want you to set up your whole life so that you can't help but remember and respond to who I am and what I've done. That's the fundamental difference. You understand this idea that God is present with you? It's the fundamental difference between the God of the Bible and the God of every other religion, ancient or contemporary, all of it. When you think about the ancients believed in a far-off God who was pretty much mad all the time, needed to be satisfied by rituals and rules and sacrifices so that maybe he would see or hear and have pity on his people, and he would send them a blessing from a distance. And he would do something for them to allow them to have victory in battle or success with their crops, success in their business, or he'd give them a blessing real time or in the future after they died. Isn't that the thing that you hear from all of the other nations that see the people of God throughout what we call the Old Testament? Wait a second, we're going into battle, but their God goes into battle with them. Ours, we're just hoping he sees us and has pity on us, sends us a blessing from a distance. But this is not a fair fight. We're doomed because they have a God who's present in their battle. He's present in their business. He's present in their everyday life. There's a God who fights with them. We're done. Isn't that the promise and the reason for the promise of God all throughout what we call the Old Testament and spilling over into the New Testament? God says, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Why? Because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. It spills over into the New Testament. I will never leave you or forsake you. What do I fear? What do you fear? Go make disciples of all the nations, teaching them all the things I've commanded you, baptizing them. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, behold, what's the promise? I'm with you, even to the ends of the earth. It's not just true in the ancient world, it's true in our world as well. You want a religion, just pick a religion. There are a lot of options of rules and rituals that you can go through. They're just a whole bunch of different options. Every other religion in the world, some combination, some mixture of rules and rituals in hopes that if you just get the right mixture just right, or the right rules and the right rituals, that somehow God will be happy with you. Way to appease a far-off God and hope to secure his blessing either today or someday in the future. You know, the problem with a lot of our Christianity is that we've left behind the most important thing about us. We've turned Christianity into something that's fundamentally not any different from any other religion in the world. It's a different option, rules and rituals, and a sea of rules and rituals. Rules and rituals are not what set the people of God apart, and they never have been. Remember, we've talked about this before. The point of the Old Testament law was not to try to make bad people behave. It was to help God's people be different. So that when their God did what our God does, there wasn't a question in the world of which God it was. Hey, that rhymed. Let me say it again. The point of the Old Testament law, the point of the rules, wasn't ever to get bad people to be good. It was to help God's people be different. So when their God did what our God does, when he showed up, the world never had a question of which God it was. A different set of rituals, a different set of rules, not what sets us apart as Christians. Because we don't believe that rules and rituals are a solution to our fundamental problem. Bad behavior is not our fundamental problem. It's a symptom of our fundamental problem. Our fundamental problem goes way deeper than bad behavior. In fact, I heard a story the other day about a guy that got married. He and his wife were in graduate school, and somebody gave them an extravagant gift that they were actually delighted in. You won't think you would be delighted in if somebody gave it to you for a marriage present. But for their marriage present, somebody gave them a brand new puppy for their wedding. And it was an extravagant gift. It was a Labrador Retriever puppy. And gave it to them, and it was well pedigreed. It came from a champion bloodline. This guy reported it. This dog that they received was the smartest dog to ever live on the face of the planet. That was this Labrador puppy that they retrieved. It loved to play. It just didn't bark. It was best behavior. It loved to work. So Labrador Retrievers do what Labrador Retrievers do. They retrieve. So early on, the experience with this dog, they teach it how to go out and retrieve the newspaper. They lived in an apartment, like graduate school, right? So it would go down the stairs, and all the way out, it would find the place where the newspapers were. It would get their newspaper and bring it back up and lay it down at their feet so that they could have the newspaper. They thought it was cool. Every time their friends were over, they show this trick, like reward the puppy. It's awesome. This is what the puppy does. Best behaved dog on the planet. A couple of years after they get it and they train it and they lived with it for a little while, they move. And when they move into a new house in a neighborhood, buy their very first house, and the Labrador puppy, the smartest dog in the world, goes with them. And 2 weeks after they've moved into this brand new house, they get a knock on their door one evening from one of the neighbors who's been elected from all of the other neighbors to come tell this couple about the problems with their very bad dog. It turns out this dog, during the day when this guy and his wife were off at work, this dog would let itself out of the doggy door and into the backyard, and it would jump the fence of the backyard, and it would go to all of the other neighbors' house, retrieve their newspapers, and bring it back to his house. And he said, no, not my dog. So sure enough, he goes out and looks in the backyard, and there in the backyard is this stockpile of newspapers in his backyard. He thinks, we got to do something about this. This perfect dog, smartest dog in the world, bad behavior, we got to do something to fix the behavior. So he decides, he and his wife, we're going to lock the doggy door. This is not going to happen again. So we lock the doggy door, and sure enough, the next day, no newspapers show up in the backyard. They walk into the house, and they realize that the brand new sofa that they had purchased for their brand new house is now torn to shreds and laying all over their house. The brand new carpet they laid on the brand new floors of their brand new house was now ripped to pieces all throughout the living room. So they pick up this perfect dog and they take the perfect dog to the vet, assuming that there must be something medically wrong with this dog. Like the dog has lost its mind, and ask the vet, what can we do about the dog's bad behavior? Hoping she could give him some medicine or something for the bad behavior. And the vet listens to the story and immediately is able to diagnose the problem. The problem is not the bad behavior. The problem is separation anxiety. And she said, here's what's happening. You're leaving the dog's by itself, and the dog finds itself alone. The dog resorts to performance to try to win you back. And so your dog was sneaking out of the doggy door over the fence to your neighbor's house. Richard, he just says, I tried to bring in the newspaper, and the master's not back with me. So maybe if I get 100 newspapers, I can be reunited with the master. You lock the door, not able to perform. The performance isn't working. So he self-destructs, destructs your house, and he turns on you. The problem's not bad behavior, it's deeper than that. Her good intentions, rooted in deep longings, have created bad behavior. Isn't that what's happened to us? We feel distance from God. We start performing as well as we know how to perform to get back into a relationship with Him, to make Him happy with us. Or to keep new rules, new ways, perform our way to Him, just find different expressions for keeping the rules and performing in different ways, wearing ourselves out, gathering all the newspapers we can possibly find to try to make God happy with us. Or we turn on ourselves. We turn on each other. We ultimately turn on Him. Isn't that what you find at the end of this story? Exodus chapter 32, Moses comes back down the mountain after the 40-day lab. The people realize God's not present with us, and Moses isn't either, and we got to do something. As Moses comes down the mountain, he hears a commotion. before he gets back to real life. And he turns to his aide, Joshua. Joshua's seen a lot of battle in his life, and he says, that's the sound of war. Moses knows the hearts of the people, and he says, that's not the sound of war. That's the sound of worship. The people had given up on the presence of God, but realized the heart has a deep, deep longing to worship something. So they took what God had given them to offer him, and they spent it on something else, and they began to worship it. They decided to build a symbol of his presence right there in the middle of the camp. They worshiped it instead of him. And we will too. Good intentions rooted in deep longings will lead us to bad behavior if we aren't able or choose not to live in the presence of our master. It's not just true of puppies. So what about you? How much of your life would you say is lived in the direct response to a God who's present wherever you're present? Not just a God who asks you to wait between your past and his promise. That God invites you to live in his presence today, and he's made it possible for that presence to be restored to us every moment of every day. It's part of the reason we're doing a 40-day lab. Most of us don't experience that. Most of us haven't encountered him in that kind of way. We've got good intentions, deep longings. But if we don't find those longings in him, we'll find it in something else. And the result is bad behavior. I want to invite you into the lab as a bridge between lecture and real life. But even before we get that, I want to invite you to respond this morning. Worship team's going to come back out in just a second and sing a song, lead us in a song. It's a familiar song. Expresses a commitment to build our lives around his presence, who he is. Here's the big question for you. What would a reoriented life look like in your life if you remembered him wherever you are? If the lecture went to life and you just decided, I'm not going to settle for a rule, I'm not going to settle for a whole bunch of rituals, what would it look like for your life to be reoriented him? And don't run immediately to a rule or a ritual. What would reorient in your life? If wherever you went, you realized he was there. If whatever you did, remembered he was with you. If the lecture went to life, what would you expect to see, experience, or encounter? I'm not asking you to commit to a rule or a ritual. All I'm asking is for you to take your next step. And your next step may just be as simple as remembering. For some of you, it's not remembering, not yet. Remembering will be tomorrow. Today, your step is receiving something. Because you realize I'm separated from God, and I don't know when he's coming back for me. I don't know when he's going to fix this separation anxiety that I have. I got good news for you. He's come, and he's done everything that you need in order for you to live with him, for him to be with you, for him to be in you today and every day for the rest of your life. And he's made it available for you if only you'll receive it as a gift. God himself came to the earth in the person of Jesus. And a lot like Moses' story, he walked up a mountain, but not a mountain called Sinai, a mountain called the skull. A cloud of darkness covered that mountain too. But unlike Moses, Jesus died on the mountain in the presence of God. God turned his face away. But he did it to take all of the ways that you've separated yourself from him and to pay for them so that they're not the issue for you anymore. And the only issue for you is if you'll respond, receive the person of God who's present in your life, offers you forgiveness of sins and everlasting life with him beginning today as a gift that costs you nothing. For some of you, you need to receive that gift in just a moment. It's as simple as you saying, God, I believe Jesus came to the earth for me, died on a cross for me, rose from the dead for me, to give me life with you as a gift, to restore my fellowship with you. It's the story of the Bible, why Jesus came. While some of us are receiving for the first time in this moment, for a bunch of us, it's an opportunity for us to remember. all of us have the opportunity to respond. The most important thing about us, the most important thing God wants for us, is to remember we serve a God who's with us wherever we go. Let's respond to that and live in that wherever we go. Will you pray with me? Father, in this moment as we respond, we're going to express a commitment through singing. And my prayer is that we would just not be people that commit to something that we're not committed to. And so in this moment, we would just take a moment to stop and think about who you are, what you've done, what you've promised. And think about our past, what you've done to make a relationship with you, your presence possible for us. And if we've never put our trust in you, to do that in this moment. For those of us who have received your gift of everlasting life with you, Lord, I pray that we would live like it this week. And in this moment, we would not just commit to keeping a whole bunch of rules, doing a ritual, but that this would be the beginning of us imagining what it would be like to live a life that's built on you. To remember and respond and to reorient our life to the fact that we serve a God who is with us wherever we go. And we're grateful in Jesus' name. Amen.